She was born a lord's daughter, yet her happiness was never hers to choose. Her future had been written in someone else's hand long before she was old enough to read it. That hand belonged to a king with a complicated past. 3 wives, 3 deaths. All mysterious, all far too convenient. On the morning of her own wedding, Elara climbed out of a 3rd-floor window and ran, into the bone-deep cold of winter, into the blind dark of Ashfen Forest, carrying nothing but a hunting knife and a secret so dangerous that the most powerful king in Valdris sent his entire patrol howling through the snow to find her. 47 days alone. Her horse, gone. Her hands, raw and bleeding. The cold no longer cut like a blade. It simply lived inside her now, permanent and quiet, like a second heartbeat she never asked for. Then the forest showed her something it had been hiding. A massive black wolf, jaws locked in an iron trap, dark blood burning through the snow around it, and amber eyes that held something no wild creature should possess. Something ancient. Something that looked at her not as prey, not as threat, but as the one person it had been waiting for. What really happened between the runaway girl and the Alpha King? And why did he choose to bleed in the snow before her, when he could have simply let her disappear? Follow along to uncover the truth hidden beneath the ice. Let the story begin. 3 days of solitude, then the forest came to her. She heard them first, or rather, she heard the absence of all other sound, the way a forest goes silent when something significant passes through it. The birds stopped, the wind dropped, as though it too was holding its breath. Elara set down the birch bark she had been using to patch the roof, moved to the window gap, and looked out. The snow beyond the cabin was white and unblemished, except for the ring of wolves. There were more than a dozen, perhaps 20. She could not count precisely because they kept very still, arranged in a perfect arc around the front of the cabin in the blue pre-dawn light. Their breath rising in small plumes, their coats a muted spectrum, white, brown, charcoal gray. Every pair of eyes that she could see from this angle was amber. Every single one. The air left her lungs in a slow, controlled way that had nothing to do with relaxation. One wolf stepped forward from the arc. Small, smaller than the others, with a gray coat the color of ash after the fire has been cold for a day. Young, Elara thought. Barely more than a yearling. It came to the base of the cabin steps and sat down with a composure entirely at odds with its size and age, and looked up at the window with amber eyes that held a spark of what she could only describe as personality. No threat, no challenge. Something closer to an introduction. Elara unlatched the door. The cold hit her like a second body, pressing against her from all sides. She stepped onto the small porch and looked at the arc of wolves and felt her pulse in her jaw and her temples and the backs of her knees. The young gray wolf, a female, she thought, though she wasn't certain why she was certain, tilted its head at her. Its tail moved, once. The wolves in the arc remained motionless. Then the arc opened. Not randomly. They stepped apart in a clean movement, almost ceremonial, creating a corridor of packed snow leading back toward the tree line. And from the trees, moving with a silence that the snow seemed to accommodate rather than impede, the black wolf came. 3 days had not diminished him. If anything, the space of days had sharpened her sense of what he was. Not a wolf, not only a wolf. Something that used the form the way a river uses a channel, filling it completely, but always implying that it could fill something larger. He moved through the corridor his pack had made, with the unhurried confidence of something that had never in its life needed to announce itself. He stopped 4 feet from the base of the steps, and then, so quietly she was not certain she had heard it, so roughened by disuse that it barely qualified as language, a single word, aimed at no one, exhaled into the cold air, the way a man exhales something he has been holding in his chest for a very long time. Warm. The amber eyes found her immediately. Not searching, already knowing, already settled on her face as though he had tracked her exact location from the first step out of the trees. The leg she had freed looked whole. He bore his weight evenly, all 4 feet planted in the snow, with a steadiness that made the injury feel like it had been in another life. From the back of the ark, a sound. Elara looked and found the source. A wolf she had not immediately noticed, older than the rest, his muzzle gone silver, his amber eyes carrying a depth that spoke of decades of watching things begin and end. He padded forward with the measured gait of age and stopped beside the black wolf, and then, slowly, in a movement that communicated unmistakable meaning, he lowered his great head. Not a bow, a submission. The deep, deliberate submission of a wolf who has made peace with the fact that he is not the largest power in the room. The thing in Elara's chest performed several complicated maneuvers. This was an alpha. Not just a wolf, not just the wolf she had freed. A king of this forest. The young gray female had followed Elara's every small movement, with the intensity of a creature cataloging information at speed. Now it stepped closer, pressed its small, cold nose against the knuckles of Elara's right hand, inhaled once, deeply, and then lay down flat in the snow with its belly exposed upward. She knew what that meant. Even without a day's training in wolf behavior, some older part of her brain, the part that her ancestors had used before they had fortified themselves with walls and titles and the elaborate social machinery of courts, understood perfectly. I trust you with my softness. Above the gray wolf's supplicant form, the black wolf looked at her. The amber in his eyes shifted, some interior quality of the light deepening, and he lowered his broad head in a motion that was brief and precise and absolutely intentional. Thank you. He said it without saying it. He said it in the oldest language, the one that runs beneath speech and beneath thought, the one that some small relict part of the human animal still knows how to hear. Elara's throat had closed entirely. She found she did not need to say anything. The forest understood her silence. He brought the deer out of the tree line, dragging it by the neck. A young roe deer, already bled, already cleaned, in the particular efficient way of a hunter who has never thought of process as separate from result. He set it at the foot of the steps, stood back. The amber eyes moved to her face. The world went very still. The massive black form seemed to gather itself and then expand, and then the expansion became something else entirely. And where there had been a wolf, there was instead a man. He was tall. That registered first, the way a cliff registers before a landscape. Tall and dark, black hair falling past his shoulders in dense waves, still caged with snow and ice. Skin the warm bronze of someone who has lived his entire life under an open sky, regardless of season. The body beneath the hair was a record of things survived. Scars that mapped old engagements across shoulders and ribs and forearms, laid down in the white relief of healed tissue over dark skin. He wore nothing except the cold, and the cold appeared to have made the same deal with him that the snow had made with his footsteps, a mutual accommodation. His eyes were amber. The same amber. Exactly, precisely, identically the same amber. Ember light in the gray morning, shot through with that quality she still had no word for. She did not faint. She had a split second of genuine surprise at herself, a kind of distant academic observation that she had not fainted. And then the world resolved back into its actual dimensions, and she was standing on a porch in the deep cold of Ashfen Forest, grip white-knuckled on the doorframe, looking at a man who had been a wolf 20 seconds ago. He looked at her. Not with threat, not with uncertainty, with that same focused, unhurried assessment she had felt from the amber eyes in the trap, as though she were the most genuinely strange and interesting thing he had encountered in a very long time. And the strangeness of it was not alarming, but simply absorbing. She did not look away. She could not have told anyone why. For perhaps 20 seconds they stood in the cold and looked at each other across the 4 feet of packed snow. His breath made a small plume in the air between them. Somewhere in the tree line, something dripped water from a branch. Then he turned and walked back toward the forest, and the pack moved with him, dissolving into the shadows between the trees, with the quiet totality of smoke in wind. Except one, the small gray female had not moved from her spot at the base of the steps. She looked up at Elara with her amber eyes and her particular expression. Composed, alert, deliberately staying. And Elara understood without being told that this small creature had made a decision. She had simply chosen. Cinder, Elara said, without knowing why that was the name. The wolf's ear twitched once. It was not disagreement. The deer did not vanish overnight. That was the first thought when Elara woke. She went to the window before the fire had fully caught, and there it lay in the morning snow, undisturbed except by Cinder, who had apparently been sleeping against it for warmth. The gray wolf looked up at Elara's face in the glass, with an expression of supreme self-satisfaction. Not a dream, not a fever. Evidence. She spent the morning butchering the deer with a practical focus that she used like armor against everything else she was not ready to think about. Her father's estate had included a working farm. She knew what to do with an animal, had watched it done 100 times, had eventually done it herself in the later years, when the estate's finances had thinned and there were fewer hands to take the unpleasant tasks. The knowledge came back with the solidity of things learned young. She was stacking the jointed meat in the cabin's cold box, a chest packed with snow and river ice, when she heard the shuffle of booted feet on the forest path. Not the wolf's silence, human weight, human pace, with the particular careful rhythm of an old man negotiating icy ground. Elara had the knife up before she had thought about it, and then she saw him and felt the specific, deflating relief of a threat resolving into something merely strange rather than dangerous. He was perhaps 60, with the look of a man who had been weather-beaten for so long that the weather had become structural. A gray habit, worn and mended many times. A leather satchel filled with the kind of herbal miscellany she recognized from her own collection. He saw Cinder first. The gray wolf had come to attention at his approach, and stopped and looked at the wolf with the equanimity of a man who had long since made peace with the unusual. "Good morning," he said, in the direction of Cinder and Elara both, apparently willing to address whichever of them turned out to speak. "I am Father Oswin of Ashwick. I am only collecting sorrel. I mean no one any harm." He said this to a young woman with a hunting knife, who was accompanied by a wolf, and his tone suggested that he considered this to be a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. He stayed for tea. Within an hour, she understood. He walked this path twice a week, had for 30 years, collecting the medicinal plants that grew in abundance along the east face of the Ashfen Oaks. He had known immediately who she was. The escaped bride of the Crimson King was not a secret in the villages bordering the forest, and had said nothing, and would say nothing. The shadows in his eyes when she mentioned King Aldric told her more than a speech would have. "You've seen him," Father Oswin said eventually. "Not the king." His eyes were on Cinder. Elara set down her cup. "Yes. More than her." He nodded at the wolf. "The alpha." She looked at her hands around the warm cup. "He transformed. In front of me." Father Oswin was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind moved through the oaks. "The monastery library has records going back to the founding of Valdris," he said finally. "Older than that, in the volumes that came with the first monks from the east. The feral-blooded, the shifters, as the common tongue has it, they were in this forest before the first stone of the first wall was laid in this kingdom. The Ashen clan." A pause. The eyes. "Amber?" "Yes." "Deep amber?" "Not yellow, not the color of new wood or autumn leaves. The color of coal that has burned down but still holds the heat," Elara said. Father Oswin's expression shifted slightly. That depth of color in a shifter's eyes indicates a lineage and a power the old texts describe only a handful of times. The texts call it fang-crowned, an alpha whose authority comes not merely from strength, but from something older, something the bloodline carries. He wrapped both hands around his own cup. In 30 years walking this forest, I have never seen eyes like that. Not in any of them. The teacup was warm against her palms. Cinder had come inside without Elara noticing, and was pressed against her left ankle, chin on the floor, watching Father Oswin with careful amber eyes. Elara turned the information over carefully, the way she turned specimens when identifying herbs, looking for what the light revealed from different angles. The deer laid at her door, the pack arrayed in a perfect arc. The old gray wolf's deliberate bow. "He's the Alpha King," she said, quietly, less to Father Oswin than to herself. "Not just a pack, a king." "The forest has had one for 20 years, Father Oswin said. "Since whatever he was before. The old texts speak of a prince, of a court. Whatever he was before the forest took him, the forest made him into this instead." He left before midday, moving back down the path with his careful old man gait. Before he disappeared around the first bend, he paused once, not turning back, only stopping, his hand resting briefly on the bark of an oak as though taking its measure. "There is a man," he said, to the path in front of him rather than to her, "who walks the eastern boundary of this forest every fortnight. Edmund Holt, the king's master of the hunt. He has walked it for 20 years. I do not think he is still looking for what he was sent to find." A pause. "I mention it only so you are not surprised, if your paths cross." His satchel heavy with sorrel and silverwort. Elara stood at the cabin door watching him go, and felt the strange two-temperature quality of the moment. The academic interest of new information, pressing against something warmer and less manageable that she could not bring herself to examine yet. She went back inside to split firewood. She was halfway through the second log when she felt the quality of the air change. Not a sound, not a movement, just the particular weight of being watched that she had grown up with at court, where watching was a skill and being watched was a condition. And she had learned to feel both as reliably as she felt the weather. She set the axe down, turned toward the tree line without urgency, without looking for the source of the feeling. She did not shield her eyes or scan the shadows. She simply looked directly at the place she knew he was and said clearly, "I know you're there." The silence held for 5 seconds. 10. Then the shadows between two of the old oaks reorganized themselves, and he stepped out of them, upright this time, in the gray morning light, wearing nothing but the cold and the particular self-possession of something that has never needed shelter to feel safe. He stopped at the edge of the tree shadow, perhaps 30 feet away. In the diffuse winter light, she could see him properly for the first time. Younger than the size of him suggested, his face unlined in the way of someone who has spent their life doing physical things, rather than courtly ones. Every feature arranged with a kind of accidental severity that owed nothing to intention, and everything to bone structure and wind exposure. There was a scar below his left collarbone, old, well-healed, running at an angle that suggested something clawed rather than cut. He looked at her. She walked toward him. Not fast, not hesitantly, the way you approach a hawk on a gauntlet, with the specific communication of certainty and calm that allows a wild thing to remain where it is. She stopped 6 feet away and turned her right hand palm up between them, fingers loose. The amber eyes moved to her hand, stayed there. Something worked behind them. Not calculation exactly, more like the careful process of an animal deciding whether a new thing belongs to the category of threat or the category of not threat. Then, with a deliberateness that stripped the gesture of anything accidental, he lifted his own hand, twice the width of hers, mapped with old scars across the knuckles, and set it against hers, palm to palm. The heat of him went through her skin like a struck match. She had expected cold. The reflex of logic said that a creature who ran barefoot through winter should be cold. He was not cold. He was warm the way stones are warm after a long summer day, the heat stored deep and slow and structural, radiating into her chilled palm in a way that moved upward through her wrist and along her arm before she had taken another breath. Neither of them moved. His palm was against her palm. The snow fell around them, indifferent and slow. Somewhere in the deep forest, a woodpecker maintained its solitary percussion. Elara's pulse had done something complicated and was now operating at an unfamiliar register. His eyes were on her face, not her hand. Her face. He withdrew first, not abruptly, the way a person pulls back from something that has burned them, but gradually, the contact ending the way warmth ends in a room when the fire goes down. A long, slow withdrawal into absence. He took a step backward, then another, then turned with the fluid totality of something that does not second-guess its decisions, and disappeared into the oaks. Elara stood in the clearing with her hands still raised, still warm where his palm had been, and listened to the forest resume its regular sounds around her. She turned back to her firewood, set her hand flat on the chopping stump, and looked at it. The warmth was already fading. She looked at the wood grain of the stump for a long time. Then she picked up the axe and finished splitting the log. He came back the next day, and the next. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories, where arrivals are announced and intentions are made clear. He appeared at the edge of the trees, or at the window, or on the porch steps, with the incremental pattern of a wild thing learning to trust a specific place. Each day slightly closer than the last. Each day staying slightly longer. On the fourth day it rained. A hard, cold February rain that turned the forest floor to gray slick and drove beneath Elara's patched roof in 3 places. She was too busy with pots and rearranged furniture to pay attention to anything outside, which was perhaps why she didn't notice him until she opened the door to empty a full pot and found him standing on the top step, soaked through, watching the rain with the impassive expression of something that considers weather a matter of opinion. She looked at him. He looked at her. She stepped aside. He came in and stood in the middle of the cabin floor and looked around with the systematic attention of an intelligence cataloging a new environment for tactical relevance. His gaze moved across the shelves of dried herbs, the hanging strips of salted venison, the stacked books, the small loom she had finally returned to. She was making something deliberately shapeless and large, in the dark wool she had traded Father Oswin a week's worth of dried herbs for, telling herself it was practical, and not thinking about who it was for. The fire, her, in that order. The fire made his hair steam. Small details of him became visible in the better light that had been unclear in the gray outdoor cold. The depth of his tan, the particular way the scars lay in the tissue, some old enough to have gone silver white, 1 or 2 still carrying the faint purple pink of things that hadn't fully resolved. And the chain around his neck, catching the firelight, a cord of dark leather, and on it, something metal, sitting against his sternum. She didn't look at it long, not yet. She got out the spare wool blanket which she offered. He looked at it with the expression of a man being offered a piece of equipment whose purpose he found baffling, but was willing to examine in good faith. He took it and turned it over once in his hands. "It goes around your shoulders," Elara said. He looked at her. "Like this." She mimed the action. He watched with complete attention, then replicated the motion with the precise economy of someone who learns through observation rather than instruction. The blanket settled around his shoulders. He looked down at it. "Warm," he said. The word came out slightly rough, like something recalled from a deep storage that had not been accessed in years. But the pronunciation was clear, and the context was exact. Elara went very still for a moment. "Yes," she said carefully. "Warm." He looked up at her with those amber eyes and said, with a precision that suggested he had been listening to her speech patterns for several days with more retention than she had accounted for, "More warm." A small pause. "Better." Something happened in her chest that she was not going to name. She got out the fire-making kit, set it on the table between them, pointed to it. "This makes fire." He picked up the small wooden box, opened it, examined the steel and flint inside with focused attention, Then, without ceremony, tipped everything out onto the table's surface. He looked at the components, then at her. "The box is empty," he said. She stared at him. The ghost of something moved at the corner of his mouth. "The box," he pointed at it. "Empty." "That—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "The steel and the flint make fire when you strike them together. The box is just for carrying them." A pause. "The box is not the important part." He looked at the steel and flint, picked up the steel, turned it over. His hands were careful with objects in a way she would come to recognize. Not delicate, but accurate. The hands of something accustomed to understanding the world through touch. He looked up. "Kael." He tapped his own sternum once, firmly. "Ta la Kael." A beat. Then, in the language she'd been using, "I am Kael." She had assumed she would name him if it came to that. The moment the assumption dissolved, she understood that it had been wrong. He had carried his name through 20 years of forest solitude, like a stone in a pocket, something small and specific to hold against forgetting. Something his mother had given him. "Elara," she said, pointed at herself. "Elara." He said it the way he handled objects, carefully, testing the shape of it. Then he set the steel and flint on the table and looked at her with a directness that she was beginning to understand was not rudeness, but simply the complete absence of the elaborate deflective social protocols that human beings constructed around their actual attention. When Kael looked at you, he was actually looking. She taught him fire, water, cold, please, and thank you that afternoon. Please puzzled him. She demonstrated its usage 3 times, explaining each time. On the 4th, he tried it. Slow, deliberate, looking directly at her as he said it, which turned what should have been a simple courtesy into something else entirely. Something that had a specific weight and a warmth she could feel in her sternum, and had no intention of examining directly. She looked at the table. "Good," she said, neutrally. He said nothing, but she could feel him still looking. The days built on each other. In the mornings, she taught him language, pointing, demonstrating, the slow accumulation of vocabulary that he absorbed with a speed that unnerved her slightly. The way watching an extremely capable person learn a new skill always contains a faint edge of disquiet. By the end of the first week, he understood most of what she said. This should not have been possible, not for something that had lived 20 years without human speech. But one evening, he tapped the ring at his chest and said, with the careful deliberateness of someone retrieving a thing stored very deep, "She spoke to me. Before." A pause. "My mother. She spoke to me every day until she could not." The words came from somewhere older than Ashfen, older than the pack. Not lost, only sleeping. By the end of the 2nd, he was forming sentences of his own. Short, spare, exactly accurate. The sentences of someone who had no interest in ornamentation and a precise sense of meaning. In the afternoons, the lessons ran the other way. He taught her to read the forest. Not the romantic version, not the idea of the forest as symbol or setting, but the actual living legibility of it. How weight distributed in snow told you what had passed and when. How the pattern of a bird's alarm call communicated direction and distance and urgency. How to read the sky through bare branches for weather. How to move through underbrush without touching a single stem. She was, initially, terrible at all of it. He did not express impatience. He simply showed her again and again, standing behind her in the snow while she tried to read a set of tracks, his arm reaching past her shoulder to point, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through her cloak back, the specific ambient warmth that was apparently constitutional in him, as natural as the amber of his eyes. She tracked the direction of his finger with great attention. She also kept her breathing very even. Cinder moved between them like a small gray moon with opinions. When Kael came too near, too quickly, which happened because his sense of personal space had been calibrated in a forest rather than a court. Cinder would shift her compact body into the gap, a furry renegotiation of terms. Elara noticed and said nothing, and was grateful in a way she also did not examine. From the edge of the trees, the old silver wolf watched. Brennan, the name Kael said with a roughness that had nothing to do with language difficulty and everything to do with something older. "Brennan teach me hunt," he said one evening, watching the old wolf at the tree line through the window. "When I am small, Brennan," he paused, searching. "Father, in the pack. My father in the pack." Elara looked at Brennan's gray shape in the twilight, the slow, careful way he moved, the patience of his watching. "He loves you," she said, without thinking about it. Kael was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, finally. The word was very simple. She did not turn to look at his face. On a Tuesday, she had started keeping a tally of days on the windowsill. The habit of counting was old and would not leave. The firelight caught the leather cord at his throat just right, and she saw it properly for the first time. The ring that hung from it was heavy silver, deeply engraved with a heraldic device she had seen on seals and flags and the gates of her father's hall since childhood. The royal sigil of Valdris. Her fingers had already moved toward it before she could correct the impulse. He watched them approach, watched her approach, his gaze moving from her hand to her face and back, with no sign of alarm, only that thorough, present attention. She lifted the ring gently, tilting it toward the fire. There was no question, no possibility of error. She had seen that device 10,000 times. She had seen that device on the iron gate of her father's hall since she was 4 years old. She had seen it on the seal that accompanied the letter naming her betrothed. She set the ring back against his chest and kept her face entirely still and filed the information in the part of her mind she used for things she was not ready to act on yet. She looked up at him. His face in the firelight was impossible to read. Not because it was closed exactly, but because the thing she was trying to read in it required a vocabulary she didn't yet have. "Kael," she said carefully, "who are you?" He looked at her for a long time. His vocabulary was not yet large enough to answer the question in all the directions it needed answering. She could see him understand this, could see the specific frustration of a mind that has grasped the full territory of the question and cannot yet reach all of it with the words available. What he said was, "I do not know all of it." And what she saw in his eyes when he said it, brief, deep, contained, was a grief so old it had gone entirely quiet. She kept the question inside her, turned it to face the wall where she could not see it, and went to put more wood on the fire. The cold peaked in the 3rd week, and then, by gradual degrees, relented. Not spring, nothing as definitive as spring, only a slight softening of the air's edge, a slight increase in the hours before dusk. The sort of change that, in a city, would go unnoticed, and in a forest announces itself through the behavior of every living thing simultaneously. The birds moved differently. The oaks made new sounds. Even Cinder seemed to recalibrate something, her amber eyes turning toward the south more frequently, as though monitoring a development. Kael and Elara had settled into a rhythm that have the particular character of things that have been arrived at organically and are not discussed, because discussing them would make them fragile. Language lessons in the morning. His vocabulary had become considerable, the sentences longer and more complex, the pauses shorter. Survival training in the afternoon. Evenings by the fire, where she read aloud from her herb lore volume, and he sat across from her with the attentiveness of someone receiving something valuable. "You do not read for the plants," he said one evening. She looked up. "What?" "The plant book. You read it—" He paused, finding the word. "Slowly. Not like reading for information, like—" He made a gesture that she couldn't interpret, then abandoned it. "You read it for the sound." She had, in fact, been reading it primarily for his sake. The herb lore entries had good vocabulary, specific, concrete, varied, and she could watch his face absorb new words and see, with absolute clarity, the moment each one embedded itself. But she was not about to say that. "I like the sound of reading aloud," she said, which was also true. He considered this. "It is—" another pause. "A slightly longer one." "Good," he said finally, and the inadequacy of the word was visible on his face. The gap between the word available and the thing meant. And she found she could not look directly at him for a moment and had to redirect her attention to the page. She taught him to cook. This was, by some measure, the least successful educational exchange they had undertaken. He approached the iron pot with the focused, diagnostic attention he brought to everything new, determined the fundamental principle within about 20 minutes, and then executed it with a confidence that outpaced his actual skill by a significant margin. The resulting soup was black on the bottom and raw in the middle, and had an odor she associated with funerary rituals. He looked at the pot, looked at her. She looked at the pot, then at him. Something cracked in her chest, and then she was laughing. Actual laughter, not the careful, social variety she had deployed for years at her father's table, but the kind that comes from the actual body, the kind she had almost forgotten she was capable of. She pressed her hand over her mouth and tried to collect herself, and failed. And when she looked up through watering eyes, he was watching her laugh with an expression she had never seen on him before. Attentive and still, but different from his usual attention. Warmer, like a door opening inward onto a room that had light in it. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, not yet, but the precursor to one, the muscular shift that precedes it. "The fire was too high," he said. "The fire," she agreed, wiping her eyes, "was significantly too high." "Next time," he said, with the exact gravity of a man issuing a strategic commitment. "Yes," she said. "Next time." They looked at each other across the smoke of his incinerated soup, and something between them that had been careful and measured and deliberate made a small, quiet step that neither of them acknowledged. The afternoon, Elara decided his hair had reached a point requiring intervention. He had been in the cabin for 2 weeks in the evenings, and for several more in the days, and she had become accustomed enough to his presence that she no longer tracked her own breathing quite as carefully. This was, she would later reflect, how it happened. "Sit," she said, in the tone she had learned worked better than explanation. She patted the stool near the fire. He sat, with the immediate and unquestioning compliance he gave to direct, clear instructions. She had noticed this early. Kael did not respond well to requests that were buried in politeness or social construction. He responded immediately and completely to straightforward statements. It was, she had found, unexpectedly restful. She had scissors from her sewing kit. She came to stand behind him and lifted a section of his hair between her fingers. The texture of it surprised her, the same way it surprised her every time she was close enough to encounter it. She expected the coarseness implied by the wildness, implied by everything else about him, and found instead something heavier and smoother than that, the kind of hair that would be described as remarkable by anyone who dealt in descriptions of hair, and had no reason to be diplomatic about it. She separated it carefully, scissors working methodically, small dark lengths falling to the cabin floor. He was entirely still. The quality of his stillness was different from his usual contained quiet. This was more deliberate, more intentional. The stillness of something exercising an active choice. His eyes, from what she could see of his profile, were half closed. She moved around to the front for the last cuts near his face, and that was when she understood that she had miscalculated the geometry of the situation. He was sitting. She was standing. She had come to stand directly in front of him to trim the hair at his temples, and in this arrangement, his eye level was precisely at her collarbone. And the distance between them, the necessary distance for the task, was nothing she could describe as a safe distance without being dishonest with herself. She reached for his jaw to tilt his head slightly to the right. Her fingers found the angle of his jaw, the bone structure under the skin, the warmth of him radiating up through her palm the moment she made contact. His eyes opened, fully, and met hers from below, amber and entirely aware. And she had the distinct sensation of someone who has stepped forward in what they believed was a large room and found the wall much closer than they remembered. She kept her hands steady. She trimmed the last section. She straightened up and said, with a neutrality she was quite proud of, "That's better." He reached up and took her right hand, not catching it, not grabbing it, simply enclosing her fingers in his and lifting her hand slightly. He guided it, with the same careful accuracy he gave everything, to the side of his face, along the line of his jaw. The pad of her thumb passed over the high architecture of his cheekbone, the hollow beneath it. His eyes were still on her face. His eyes were always on her face when they were close like this, and she was increasingly unable to decide whether that was better or worse than the alternative. "Proper," he said. The word she had used earlier, in some context she couldn't now reconstruct, but in his voice it became something else. The slight foreignness of it, the slightly formal weight he gave it, transformed a courtesy word into something she could feel in the center of her sternum. "Proper," she agreed. And then, because she could not prevent it, she laughed, just slightly. And the laugh was the crack that let something lighter into the room. He laughed. The sound of it went through her like heat goes through cold water. Everywhere at once, instantaneous, changing the temperature of the whole. Low and full and genuine, completely unguarded in a way that none of his other expressions were. The laugh of someone who has either forgotten to be careful or decided not to be. It lasted only a moment before his expression recovered its habitual composure. But the room was different after it, the way a room is different after someone has opened a window. He stood then. The movement brought him close, closer than the haircut had required, closer than anything had required yet. His eyes dropped briefly to her face, and then back up. "Late," he said, looking toward the dark window. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. He crossed to the door, paused with his hand on the frame, his back to her. The firelight made his shadow long on the floor between them. He did not turn. But he was still there, the pause extended, carrying weight. Then he went out, and the cold came briefly in through the door before the latch fell, and she was alone. "Don't," Elara told the wolf. Cinder lay her chin on her paws. 6 weeks after the night of the trap, Elara needed salt. This was not a metaphor or a feeling. She had catalogued her remaining supplies with the careful methodology she brought to problems she could solve. 3 days of salt left, candles nearly gone, 2 medicinal herbs depleted that did not grow in Ashfen, and which she was not willing to run low on. A practical problem requiring a practical solution. The village of Ashwick lay 2 hours south through the forest, at the edge of the trees where the farmland began. She had seen it from the upper ridge on clear days. The church spire, the mill, the particular dense arrangement of rooftops that meant a settlement old enough to have settled into itself. She had avoided it for 6 weeks, for obvious reasons. She was avoiding it now for only slightly less obvious reasons. And those reasons were called 12 days of grace, left in Father Oswin's estimate of how long before Aldric's patrols rotated to a new search pattern. She told Kael she was going to the village. He looked at her. 2 hours, she said. "I'll be back before dark. Cinder can come." His amber eyes moved over her face with the particular quality of someone reading a situation in more registers than she had access to. The line of his jaw had tightened slightly, she noticed. A fractional change. "I will come," he said. "You can't come. You would—" She gestured at him, meaning all of this, meaning the amber eyes and the barefoot in winter constitution, and the specific quality of presence that made horses nervous and men reach for their weapons. "You would attract attention." A pause. "I will follow," he said. "Not in the village, in the trees." She opened her mouth. "You will not see me," he said, and in his voice there was no negotiation. She went to the village. She did not see him. She felt him. The particular quality of being watched by someone who knows what they're doing, which was different from the surveillance of Aldric's court. in the same way that a hawk in a thermal is different from a hawk on a chain. Present, but not oppressive, a kind of attention that protected rather than contained. The Ashwick market was small and provincial, and full of the reassuring ordinary human commerce of a winter trading day. Cabbages, wool, saltfish, a man selling pig iron, a woman with a basket of hard cheese. Elara pulled her hood low and moved efficiently, exchanging the small packets of dried herbs and river-cured hide she had brought for salt and tallow candles and a small packet of the dried yarrow she needed. She was almost to the edge of the market when she heard her name. Lady Elara. The voice was old, startled, entirely sincere. A trader from the Varan district. She recognized him dimly. One of the men who had done business with her father's estate. No malice in him. Not a single harmful intention. He had simply recognized a face he knew and made the sound that came with recognition. It was enough. She did not look. She turned and moved toward the lane that ran behind the market stalls with the practiced composure of someone who has not heard anything and is simply going about their business. Her pulse was at her jaw, at her wrists, in the soles of her feet. 20 paces. 10. The two men who stepped out of the shadows of the tannery wall were not wearing Valdris colors. They were dressed in nondescript brown wool, the careful anonymity of people who do not want to be identified as what they are. But she recognized the posture, the way soldiers stand, even at rest, always already arranged for action, and her feet stopped without consulting her intention. The lane went small. Lady Elara, the one on the left, had a voice like a door being shut firmly, flat and final. We've been hoping to cross paths. Sir Gareth sends his regards. She looked at the space between them and the market behind her and the tannery wall on her right and ran the mathematics instantly. It did not come out in her favor. The tannery, think. The tannery lane leads to... She made 2 steps backward, was turning for the lane's far end, had gotten as far as a coherent plan when the door of the tannery itself opened directly into her path, and the man who came through it was not at all like the other two. The other two were soldiers doing a job. This man was something else. Sir Gareth Crown was tall in a way that suggested architecture rather than biology, armored in black beneath his riding coat, with a face that showed the accumulated disregard for other faces that came from a career built on making them do things they hadn't planned to do. The sword at his back was unusual, the grip wrapped in white leather, the scabbard chased with silver wire, the whole thing constructed for a specific purpose that she, standing in a cold lane in Ashwick, understood in her stomach before she understood it in her mind. Silver. Silver-tipped. Silver-edged. Made for one thing. I understand the journey has been difficult, Gareth said, in the voice of a man who has never taken the journey into account. The king is patient. He will be patient until tonight, and then he won't be. And then the circumstances of your return will be considerably less comfortable. I recommend tonight. The cold of the lane pressed against her back. Cinder was against her right leg, silent, very still. The specific stillness of an animal who has assessed something and arrived at a conclusion. I know what happened to his other wives, Elara said. Her voice was steady. She watched 2 of the 3 guards shift their weight in the specific way people shift their weight when they are trying not to look like they've heard something they've heard many times and cannot unhear. All 3 of them. I imagine you do too. Gareth's expression moved approximately the amount that a stone carving's expression moves. My lady. The horn call she had been half listening for in the back of her mind every day for 6 weeks chose that moment to become irrelevant. The sound came from the north edge of the village. Not a horn. Older than a horn. A sound that the February air carried without diminishing, that moved through the walls of the buildings and the packed snow of the lane and into the bodies of every person present as directly as a hand pressing against the sternum. It said, I am here. I am old. I have made no peace with anything. The horses at the market hitching post, good horses, Trained horses, horses with more military exposure than most men, began pulling at their ties. Gareth's hand moved to the white-wrapped hilt. Kael came from the north end of the lane. He had taken his time becoming visible, which she would understand later was deliberate. The approach calculated to be seen from a distance, to allow full accounting of what was coming, and full consideration of whether to stand in its way. He was in the form he used in the village, the human form, wearing the rough wool cloak Elara had made for him, because it was the only garment he would accept. His hair was down. He walked at the pace of someone who has never been in a hurry, because hurry implies that something else has power over your timeline. The guards with the flat voices both took steps back that she did not think they were conscious of taking. "Shifter," Gareth said, under his breath, with the flat recognition of a professional. He drew the silver sword with the particular efficiency of a man who has practiced the motion to the point where it has become like breathing. Kael glanced at the sword once, then looked past it at Gareth, with an expression that suggested he found the weapon less concerning than the person holding it. What happened next was very fast, and she followed only parts of it. The guards moved first, and were not factors for long. The kind of rapid elimination that barely registered as violence, because it was over before the mind could categorize it. Gareth was a different matter. Gareth moved like a man who had spent decades learning exactly how to kill things that were faster and stronger than human beings. And the fight between them had the quality of two systems of lethality finding each other's limits. She saw the silver blade find the gap below Kael's shoulder. Not deep. The entry was shallow, the blow deflected by Kael's motion. But the contact was made. A sound left him, not a cry, something lower and more internal. A sound that went into her like a splinter and lodged. Gareth went down. Kael stood over him, breathing hard, and the amber in his eyes had gone incandescent, brighter than she had ever seen it, lit from within like a lamp held up to show its mechanism. "We need to go," she said. She was already moving toward him. He turned when she reached him, and she saw it now, the wound, the left shoulder, already darkening at the edge in a way that had nothing to do with bruising. A color at the margins that was wrong, chemical. The darkness moving in tiny increments through the channels of his skin beneath the surface. Elara. Her name in his voice, slightly roughened, and she understood that the roughening was not pain exactly, but something that pain was doing to the edges of his control. "I know," she said. "I've got you." From somewhere behind them, from the mouth of the tannery lane, where the path to the eastern forest boundary began, where a man who walked that boundary every fortnight might reasonably pass on a market day, she heard a voice she recognized without expecting to, measured, old, carrying authority. "You saw nothing here but wild animals. Take the knight to the garrison. Tell the king his quarry is dead. That is all you know." Edmund Holt stood at the far end of the lane, his hunter's coat and hunter's bearing, and 20 years of service to the crown, making the 3 remaining soldiers smaller by proximity. He was not drawing a weapon. He was doing something much more unsettling, which was standing in the posture of a man who does not need to draw anything. Elara looked at Edmund Holt. Edmund Holt looked at her. In his face she read the particular weight of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has decided today is the day to put it down. "I know where the Ashfen clan camps," he said quietly, speaking to her and no one else. "The silver wound. I've seen it before. She'll have what he needs." Kael's weight had shifted incrementally against her side. Not collapse, he was not collapsing, but a redistribution that spoke to something happening beneath the surface of his skin. She looked at the wound. She looked at Edmund. She made the calculation that had to be made. "Tell me," she said. They got him back to the cabin as the light failed entirely. By the time they crossed the threshold, Kael had stopped speaking. Not in the way of someone unconscious. His eyes were open, tracking the room, tracking her. But the resources required for language had apparently been redirected to other purposes. He sat where she put him, on the cabin's single chair pulled close to the fire, and breathed with a careful precision that told her he was managing something very actively. The wound at his shoulder had continued its progression. She had seen it in the forest, on the way back, stripped back the cloak to check it twice, both times regretting it. The silver coloring at the margins had mapped itself along 3 traceable routes beneath the skin, following what she recognized, from her herb lore study, as the lymphatic lines. Not the bright silver of the blade. Something darker. Something that suggested the metal had already undergone a process of dissolution and was now conducting itself through his body as something chemical rather than something physical. Edmund sat down without being invited, in the way of a man who has been holding something for a long time and needs to sit when he finally puts it down. The blade was silver alloy, he said, standard composition for the guard's anti-shifter weapons, but Gareth had the tip treated with silver salt. It slows the body's natural process for expelling the metal. Without help, his body will clear it. He's an alpha. The constitution of it is— He paused. But it will take days, and those days will be difficult. Kael was looking at Edmund, looking at him the way he looked at things he was trying to read through surfaces. Elara was binding the shoulder, clean cloth pressed firmly, trying to isolate the entry point, even knowing that the battle was already happening underneath the skin, rather than on it. Her hands were steady. She needed them to be steady. Edmund said, "There's something else." She tied off the bandage, kept her eyes on her work. "The woman whose clan we're going to for help." Edmund's voice had changed slightly, something in its texture. "She is the sister of Kael's mother, and I am the man who was ordered to kill his mother 20 years ago." The cabin was very quiet. "Tell me," Elara said. Her hands had stopped moving. Edmund told it flatly, the way a man recites a list of facts that have become facts because they were true once, and being true once is permanent. A shifter queen who had hidden what she was. A king who had loved her until he understood what she was, and had loved himself considerably more. An infant with amber eyes that no courtly explanation could account for. An order given in a cold room. A night in a forest, 20 years ago in winter. "She transformed to protect him," Edmund said. "The child. She put herself between me and him. He stopped. "I killed her. But the child. I left the child in the snow by a wolf den and walked away. And told the king it was done, and the king made me his master of the hunt. And I went home, and I slept in that bed for 20 years. The fire popped. Cinder had gone entirely still by the hearth. Kael spoke. 3 words, very clear, in the silence after Edmund's voice stopped. He killed her. Not a question. A statement of a thing that had been suspected for 20 years and was now confirmed. "The king ordered it," Edmund said. "I carried it out." "There is no difference," Elara said, quietly. Edmund did not argue. He looked at his hands in his lap. "You owe him," she said. "You owe him the only thing that is left to give, which is going to the woman whose sister you killed and telling her the boy she has been searching for is alive. Because you know she has been searching. You know that." She paused. "This is not forgiveness. This is a debt that does not expire." The silence held for a long time. Edmund stood. He stopped at the door, his back to both of them. "Keep the wound clean. Give him water, as much as he'll take. Don't let him transform. It will accelerate the spread." He put his hand on the door without opening it. "The Ashfen clan camps to the northeast, 1 day's walk. I'll go tonight." He went out. The cold came in briefly, and then the door was closed, and there was only the fire, and Cinder, and Kael in the chair with the silver working through him, in the dark beneath his skin. Elara pulled her stool to his side and began the work of the night. She had done night vigils before. Her mother's last illness, a stable hand at her father's estate who had taken a bad fall from a horse. She knew the particular quality of night-long attention, the way time changed its texture after midnight. the cold, specific exhaustion of sustained watching. She knew how to keep her hands busy and her mind focused on the next task, rather than the weight of the one she could not do anything about. She brewed yarrow tea with willow bark for the fever she could already feel building at his skin. She changed the dressing twice. She kept the fire high. Around midnight, Cinder moved to the door and made a sound. Not a howl, not the alarm call, but something lower and more deliberate, sustained for perhaps 20 seconds. And then silence. And then, from outside in the dark, answering sounds. Many of them, the entire register of the pack. Brief and muted, not the exuberant volume of wolves calling for the pleasure of it, but something more purposeful. An acknowledgement. She went to the window. The forest beyond the cabin was impenetrable dark, but she could feel them out there, in the way she had learned, over these weeks, to feel presences she could not see, the weight of many attentive lives standing silent in the cold. Brennan's voice came once, from directly below the window, a single, low note that seemed to go through the cabin walls rather than around them, that pressed briefly against her chest like a hand applied in comfort. She went back to Kael and changed the dressing again and made him drink more water, and sat beside him and listened to the night pack keep their silent watch outside. She fell asleep somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, her head bowing forward until it rested on the arm of his chair. She did not know this, she was simply tired, and then she was not conscious of anything for a time. And the pack was in the trees, and the fire kept itself alive as fire sometimes will in the last cold hours before dawn. She woke because she was warm, not the warmth of the fire, which had gone low while she slept. A specific, directional warmth, from above and to the right, descending. She came to awareness slowly, from the bottom up, and found that her head was on his forearm, and that his free hand was resting very lightly on her hair. Not moving, not doing anything except being there. The way a hand rests against something it does not want to disturb. She kept very still for a moment, eyes not yet open. She could hear him breathing, slower now, the terrible, careful precision of it gone, the fever having broken sometime in the dark. She could feel the steadiness of him, the resolution of something that had been in crisis, into something that had resolved. She opened her eyes. He was looking at the window, where the first gray suggestion of dawn was working itself into the dark. His profile in the low light had the specific quality of things seen without pretense, unguarded, present, the face of someone who is not performing being awake, but simply is. His hand was still in her hair. She sat up slowly, and his hand moved away with the same gradualness, as though waking from the same slow dream. She rubbed her face, looked at him. He looked at her. "Still here," he said. 2 words. She was not going to think about how those 2 words went into her and stayed there. "Yes," she said. "How do you feel?" He considered this with his usual thoroughness. "Less like dying. More like having been close to it." She stood up, stretched her back, went to the fire and fed it. Her hands were shaking slightly. The specific, delayed shaking of prolonged tension finally released. She kept her back to him for a moment, building the fire up. Behind her, very quietly, he said, "Elara." She turned. "Thank you," he said. Slowly, directly, without anything social layered over or under it. Just the words, just the meaning, weighted the way he weighted everything, fully, without reservation. She looked at him for one moment too long to pretend she was looking at anything else, and then turned back to the fire and said, with perfect composure, "You're welcome. Now drink the rest of that yarrow water." He recovered the way he did most things, thoroughly, and faster than she expected. By the 2nd morning after the wound, he was sitting up without assistance. By the 3rd evening, the silver coloring beneath his skin had faded to pale marks that were almost invisible. She changed the dressing for the last time on the 4th day and found the wound itself halfway to healed already. The tissue knitting itself with the particular speed she was beginning to understand, was characteristic. The shifter constitution not built for permanence of injury. She was making soup, real soup, not the one he had made, actual soup with actual dimensions. When he came to stand behind her at the fire and watched the pot with the expression of a student who has acquired new respect for their subject. "I made a mistake," he said. "The soup." "Several," she agreed pleasantly. "The fire was too high." "The fire was the smallest problem," she stirred. "The order of the ingredients was also not ideal, and I believe you may have used all of the salt." He was quiet for a moment. "I will learn," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete absence of defensiveness, the absolute willingness to begin again, was so different from every other kind of pride she had encountered in 19 years of courtly life that she felt it as a small, clean ache. "I know you will," she said. That evening, after the soup, and after Cinder had settled herself in her accustomed spot between the fire and the door, Elara sat down across from him and put the thing she had been carrying on the table between them. "I found your ring," she said. "The first night I saw it, weeks ago. I knew the device. I've known it since I was a child, on seals and banners and the iron gate of my father's hall." She met his eyes. "The royal sigil of Valdris." He did not move. "King Aldric is your father," she said, "and he is the man who ordered his soldiers to drag me into a marriage I had no say in. He is the man who had your mother killed." She let the silence hold for a moment. "We are being hunted by the same person, Kael. We have been since before we met." He reached up and took the ring from the cord at his chest, held it in his palm. The fire caught it and made the Valdris sigil flare briefly. The crowned wolf, the 3 stars. The device she had been taught meant authority and order and the safety of the realm. He set it on the table, looked at it for a long time, then looked at her. "He is not my father," he said, with a quiet that was more final than anger. "He is the man who killed my mother. Those are not the same." "No," she said. "They're not." "We need to go," he said. "Seraphine, my mother's clan. Edmund said—" "I know." She had been thinking about this since the lane in Ashwick, turning over the pieces, looking for what fit. "But I need you to know something first." She paused. "I knew for weeks. About the ring. I kept it because I didn't have the words to explain it to you. And then I kept it because—" She stopped. He waited with his characteristic patience, with no pressure and no performance. "Because I was frightened," she said. "Not of you, of what it meant. Of what it changed." The fire moved behind him. His face in the warm light was open in the way it was only in these moments. Late evenings, low fire, the particular candor that darkness permitted. He stood up, came around the table, stood in front of her. She looked up at him. He lifted his hand and placed it very lightly against the side of her face, his palm to her cheekbone, the thumb at the edge of her jaw, holding nothing, containing nothing, just present, just there. His eyes were on hers. He was asking with them, clearly, the way he had been conducting most of their important communications since the beginning, in the language beneath language, the one they had both always known. She answered by not moving. The kiss was not tentative. It was not uncertain. It was what everything about him had prepared her to expect, which was the absolute, unambiguous commitment of something that does not do things halfway. But it was also quiet, the way the deepest things are quiet. Not a storm, a decision. She kissed him back. His hand moved from her cheek to the back of her head, unhurried, deliberate. The same careful hand she had watched handle fire and knife and wounded animals and an iron trap's mechanism. She had her hands against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat, faster than usual. The rate of it, the one thing that was not contained. They were sitting by the diminished fire, and she said, quietly, to the air above them, "I love you." She had not planned to say it. It came out the way the important things always came out, in the moment when she had stopped trying to manage what she was, and was simply what she was. The silence after it lasted long enough that she started to wonder if she should address it, and then she felt his hand take hers, and he pressed it once against his own chest, against the heartbeat. Then he moved her hand to press flat against her own chest. Mine, and yours. I do not have the words for this, he said. I have only this. It was, she thought, more than sufficient. Outside, footsteps, many, careful, not the footsteps of lads. Kael was upright before she had finished interpreting the sound. She came to the window beside him and looked. Moonlight on gray figures. Not soldiers. Not the posture of Aldric's men. Taller, differently arranged, and moving with the particular fluid quality she recognized. Shifters. At the center of the group, a woman. Tall, 40 perhaps, wearing gray wool over a coat of dark fur, moving with the specific authority of someone who has never needed to perform authority because it has simply been present in them from birth. Beside her, reduced by proximity to a smaller scale than she had ever seen him, Edmund Holt. Kael crossed the cabin floor in 3 steps and opened the door. The moonlight came in with the cold. The woman leading the group stopped. She was looking at Kael the way you look at something you have been holding in your mind for 20 years, and they're now being asked to believe is standing in front of you in real dimensions. Her eyes were amber. Of course they were amber. Exactly the same amber, the same depth, the specific quality that Father Oswin had struggled to describe, and Elara had found the words for on the night of the trap. Coal that has burned down, but still holds the heat. Seraphine stepped forward. She lifted both hands and placed them on either side of Kael's face. Not a greeting, something older and more functional. The full direct contact of someone verifying the reality of a thing they are afraid to be wrong about. She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were bright. She was not, Elara thought, a woman who wept easily or often. Son of Lyra, she said, in a voice that held the specific weight of 2 words that have been rehearsed for 20 years against the chance of being used. I have been looking for you since the winter you were born. Behind her, Edmund Holt had gone very still. The group of shifters around him had not drawn weapons, but the quality of their stillness communicated clearly enough. Seraphine released Kael's face and turned. She walked to Edmund. She was not hurrying. The deliberateness of her pace, the completeness of her attention, was worse than anything aggressive could have been. Edmund stood in the snow and looked at her coming toward him, and did not step back. You killed my sister, she said. Yes, he said. She was 23 years old. She loved her child. She died trying to protect him. Yes. The silence lasted long enough that Elara found she was holding her breath. I will not kill you, Seraphine said finally. You brought him back. That is not forgiveness. I want you to understand that clearly. It is a transaction. You owed a debt and you paid part of it. The rest? Her amber eyes moved over his face with a quality that was not unlike what a ledger looks like. The rest, you will pay while you breathe, in ways I will determine. Do you understand? Yes, Edmund said. It was the 3rd time he had said it, and each time the word had carried more weight. Seraphine turned back. Her gaze crossed the doorway and found Elara, standing just behind Kael's shoulder. She looked at Elara for a long moment, with the assessment of a woman accustomed to reading the weather in human faces. He has named you his, she said, not unkindly. In our people, this is not a proposal. It is a recognition, something that already happened and is simply being named. A pause. Do you understand what you are accepting? Elara thought about a forest in winter, about 47 days of choosing the dark over the comfortable, about amber eyes in a trap, seeing her and waiting, about what it meant to be handed a map of someone's interior and trusted to navigate it carefully. I know what I'm leaving behind, she said. I don't know exactly what I'm walking toward, but I know which direction I want to go. Seraphine's expression shifted, slightly. A small opening, not quite a smile, something more economical than a smile. "That will do," she said. "It will more than do." The morning was clear. After the particular violence of winter, the air on this morning had the quality of something that has decided to try a different approach. Still cold, but with a brightness in it. The light at a different angle. The sky above the oaks carrying the blue of possibility, rather than the blue of endurance. Elara stood at the edge of the clearing and watched Kael say goodbye to his pack. He had gone to them as the wolf, the black wolf, massive and fluid, moving through the snow with a weightlessness that still, after all these weeks, altered something in her breathing to see. He went to them one by one, Cinder first, the two of them nose to nose for a long moment, the gray female's tail moving once, twice, and then still. The other wolves of the inner circle, names she had learned, faces she had learned to read. Brennan last. The old silver wolf came to Kael as Kael turned to face him, and the two of them stood in the early light without moving. Brennan was old. Old in the way of things that have seen everything the world contains and have arrived at a peace with its full dimensions. He took one step forward and lowered his great gray head, the same gesture of absolute submission that Elara had seen on the first morning, but carrying something different now. Not the submission of a subordinate to an authority, but the submission of someone who loves a thing and understands it must be released. Kael, under the black coat, bowed his head in return. Not as an alpha returning the acknowledgement of a lesser wolf, as a son to the first father he had ever known. Elara looked away, looked at the ground, pressed her lips together, and waited for the moment to pass enough to be able to see clearly. Seraphine appeared at her elbow, silent as all her people were silent. She said nothing for a moment, looking out at the scene in the snow. "He was always going to leave the forest," she said, finally. "Not a judgment, an observation. What he is, the human part of him, and what the human part of him needs, it couldn't stay here forever. The pack kept him alive and made him strong, but it could not make him whole." Elara watched Kael transform back, the change still carrying that quality of inevitability. Not violent, not alarming, simply the natural conclusion of one form and the beginning of another. The clothing the clan had brought was different from anything she had seen him wear. Dark wool, well-made, the workmanship of people who had been doing this for generations. He stood in it in the morning light and looked like himself. Not her creature, not the wolf, not the prince, not any one category. Himself. He was putting something in an interior pocket. She recognized the shape of it, the leather cord, the ring. Not hanging outside anymore.